Alright, so I've been lucky enough to test out some of the fastest gaming monitors that you can currently buy. The 360Hz PG259QN from Asus, the 240Hz FI27QX from Aorus, and the 160Hz 27GN950 from LG. One of the most important details between them though is the resolution, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K respectively. And I think that's where the purchasing decision for the consumer becomes really difficult. You're essentially playing this balancing act where the higher resolution panel you go with, the lower refresh rate you have to compromise with. Now I've tested and played extensively on all three of these gaming monitors and the different resolutions and refresh rates that they have to offer, and today I want to convey my experiences and thoughts on which one I think you guys should go with and the factors that you need to consider. Let's start with some good news first, and that's that despite all three of these monitors offering the highest refresh rate at their given resolution, they all actually use IPS panels. So that's kind of my first bit of advice. If you're buying a TN panel in 2021, you're simply doing it wrong. The only exception here in my opinion would be BenQ's lineup of TN displays with DIAC technology, but that's only if you consider yourself an esports gamer and you're okay with the significantly worse looking panel compared to IPS. Don't get me wrong, IPS panels are still a little bit slower compared to TN when it comes to response times with a bit more smearing, but trust me when I say that the trade-off for much better colors is absolutely worth it. I'd also argue that a more vibrant and punchier image are just as important in competitive titles, helping you see targets a lot faster and clearer. Now before we take a look at 1440p and 4K, let's first discuss 1080p and whether this is still a relevant resolution to be considering in 2021. And the answer is absolutely. In fact, most of you guys watching this are probably watching on a 1080p display based off of the recent Steam hardware survey. And I think the biggest reason to still consider a 1080p display in 2021 is if you just don't have the GPU power to run higher resolutions. Maybe you're still running an older GPU and you just don't want to upgrade, which there's nothing wrong with at all. Not everyone needs to be spending thousands of dollars on a gaming PC. Today, you can get a really solid 1080p gaming experience on more affordable hardware. Not to mention, prices for fast 1080p gaming monitors with accurate IPS panels have also become a lot more affordable. And sure, for story-based titles, you won't be getting the best experience possible compared to 1440p and 4K, but you can still totally get an involving and enjoyable experience on a 1080p monitor and cheaper hardware. Now, funnily enough, the other group of users who should still be considering a 1080p display in 2021 is the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and it's the esports enthusiasts. There's no way to cut it. If you want the least amount of input latency possible and the highest frame rates possible, 1080p is absolutely the way to go. Now that's not only because the highest refresh rates happen to be on 1080p gaming monitors, but it's also because you'll achieve a higher sustained frame rate as well compared to something like 1440p. Speaking of 1440p though, before I tested the Aorus FI27QX, I would have never recommended that esports gamers pick up a 1440p display, but the fact that this can run up to 240Hz, has fast response times, and we actually have the GPU power to run those specs now in relevant games, that has changed my mind completely. And it's only after giving higher resolution panels like this and the 27GN950 an honest chance that I've realized the competitive benefit that higher resolution displays can have, especially if you're playing games that involve fighting at longer ranges. That higher image detail does help. Now even if you're not interested in running 1440p 240Hz like the FI27QX, GPUs like the RTX 3060 Ti are totally capable at this resolution and would make a solid pair for a 1440p 144Hz or even 160Hz monitor. Even with the RTX 3060 coming out later this month, I'd expect that too to be a great fit for 1440p. It's only natural that as GPUs become more powerful at these more affordable price points that we move to higher resolution displays. 1440p would also be a great pair if you have a high-end 20 series card such as an RTX 2080 or higher, and also for those still hanging onto their GTX 1080 Ti's. So ultimately, if you are building a new gaming PC in 2021 with these new mainstream GPUs, then a 1440p gaming monitor I think is going to be the best fit. That is of course unless you fall into the other esports enthusiast group that I mentioned earlier, then 1080p is probably still relevant for you and you might want to consider a 240Hz or even 360Hz option. But now let's talk about 4K, and after using LG's 27GN950 for around 5 months or so, I've got a bit more to add to my initial review. Firstly, the bump up to a 160Hz refresh rate. It can be done via a simple firmware update, but it's not not guaranteed. For that reason, it's probably safer if we just consider this a 144Hz monitor out of the box. LG will actually be releasing an updated true 160Hz option very soon, so you might want to hold out for that one instead. But one question that some of you might have is whether 4K gaming is actually worth it on a 27-inch display in the first place. Like, can you actually see all of that resolution? And the answer is yes, but it's getting close to what we define as a retina display, where you can't visibly discern the individual pixels. So while 1440p equates to around a 1.78 times increase in resolution over 1080p, 4K represents a 2.25 times increase over 1440p. From this alone, you can understand just how much more demanding 4K gaming actually is. Think of it like this: if you're gaming at 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, your GPU is rendering 497 million pixels per second, but that same pixel rate at 1440p, you're able to render over twice the amount of frames per second. Now this is a really oversimplified explanation, and there are a lot of factors that play into this, like CPU load and video memory, but you get the overall picture. The point here is that I would hands down take the higher frame rate 1440p experience here over 4K 60 FPS for pretty much any game any day of the week. That stands true even for story-based titles, where the immersion and involvement is a lot better at higher frame rates, giving you faster inputs and more lifelike animations. You can get that at 4K as well, but you really do need at least an RTX 3080 or higher before you can even think about running 4K at above 100 FPS. But if you do have that kind of cash to spare, and you do have one of these new higher end GPUs, 4K gaming really can be something. The level of detail, the textures that just weren't there before, the imperfections in the textures, it's something that you just don't see at 1440p or 1080p. Whether that's something that you actually care about is up to you, but it's definitely worth noting. Another thing that I'll add here that I didn't really mention in my initial review of the 27GN950 is that even if you can't hit your desired frame rate in some of the games that you're playing, don't be afraid to simply turn down the rendering resolution of the game. In fact, that's exactly what I do when playing Call of Duty Warzone and Apex Legends on this monitor, as otherwise even with an RTX 3090, those games can't run at 4K 160 FPS continuously. For some, me included, this is the slight compromise that you'll have to make to still benefit from a 4K panel in other areas such as video and photo editing. Alright, so with all of that info out of the way, which one should you go with? Well, referencing the Steam hardware survey that I mentioned earlier, most of you watching this should probably go with a high refresh rate 1080p display. One that I can recommend specifically is the MSI MAG251RX, which I've done a review on previously. It has an accurate, beautiful, and vibrant IPS panel with a 240Hz refresh rate without breaking the bank. Then, if you're lucky enough to get your hands on a new mainstream GPU, these can take full advantage of a 1440p display, so that's kind of what I'd recommend there. There are a few 1440p 240Hz IPS options out there, so if you're into more first-person shooters and esports titles, definitely check those out. But if you're trying to be a little bit more realistic with your budget and trying to save a bit more cash, there are plenty of 144Hz and 165Hz 1440p options as well. Then there's the smallest group, I think, which should be considering 4K, which for gaming specifically, if you're interested in 4K gaming, it's really for those who only get a kick out of all of that detail and grit and texture that you get from that kind of retina-like 4K gaming experience. And I can't stress this enough, you absolutely need a high-end GPU, 3080 and upwards ideally. 4K is also the best option if you're choosing a physically larger display such as 32 inches or maybe the 48-inch OLED from LG, and of course if you do other work on your monitor such as video editing like myself. So I really hope this video made your purchasing decision a little bit easier, and if you're after some recommendations, I will have some listed down below in the description. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.